Hi, and welcome to this video introducing the final update to the Universal Category System, what we're calling version 8.2. In this video, I just want to walk you through what's new in the list, give you an update on where things stand, and talk a little bit about the system one final time. When we started this project in the beginning of COVID in 2020, our intention was simply to provide something useful to the sound community as a way to classify sound effects. The list now has 82 top-level categories. That's the same as the first version that we released, 8.0. We've never added any more new top-level categories. But with this update, today we're bringing the list to 753 total category, subcategory pairs. So we've added quite a few subcategories into this list, but that number is deceiving. As we'll see, there's a lot of repetition in the new categories. The list is now translated into 20 languages. We're adding 2 more, Korean and Hindi, will be released along with this update. So that brings the total number of translated languages to 20. At this point, UCS is pretty much adopted by every major library software. SoundMiner, Basshead, Soundly all have interactions with it, as do many other programs like Sound Particles, Snapper by AudioEase, etc. Many large vendors, including Pro Sound Effects and Boom and many others, have either redone their entire sound library into UCS or at least using it or functions of it in their new releases. A lot of independent libraries have adopted it. So it's becoming fairly widespread, which makes me happy. And now I feel like the system is more or less complete. So where do things stand? So to me, the system, well, it's not perfect, and we knew it never would be perfect. It's now quite functional and pretty much complete in my mind. I certainly recognize that making an update in general is a disruptive process to anybody who's using the system. Anytime we come up with a new version of the list, we're basically saying, here's a bunch of new categories. And that can definitely be disruptive. So I realize that now is probably the perfect time to just lock off the system, say, you know what, it's as good as we think we can make it. Even though we could potentially add categories every year, that's going to be more disruptive than helpful to people at this point. So with this update, version 8.2, I'm pretty much calling the list complete. So UCS has taken way more time than I had hoped or imagined when I started it. Even with the help of so many people who helped along the way, it's taken me personally many, many months of my time, and I simply don't have any more time. And so it's time to move on. It's time to say the list is good, the list is solid, and it's simply time for me to move on to other things. So what that means is that there are no more planned updates to the list beyond this version 8.2. We're literally calling this the final version. Now, that doesn't mean in 5 years' time, I suppose, somebody could revisit this down the line or something like that, but there's no plans at this point. I think it's much more productive and useful to say the list, with whatever flaws that it might still contain, is just going to be locked off. It's going to be stable. There won't be any more changes going forward. So what are the next steps for the system? Because of some issues we were having with Google Drive, at the moment, if you click through the homepage at universalcategorysystem.com, you'll be brought to a Dropbox page where all the files are hosted at the moment instead of Google Drive. Google Drive locked us out for some reason. And even though it's functioning again, we're just going to leave it on Dropbox for now. All the various tools that exist should, by the time I post this video, be updated to 8.2. So things like Audio Category Clipper, Aaron Sendin's Reaper tools, the Keyboard Maestro macros that we made, the folder sets, everything should basically now reflect version 8.2. And hopefully by the time this is released, we'll have SoundMiner automatically update its list to 8.2 as well. But if not, I'm going to include the category CSV list that SoundMiner needs at version 8.2 so that anybody can simply download that as well. I've maintained a mailing list for UCS at something called groups.io. It's cumbersome and it's not ideal. And eventually I'm going to dissolve that mailing list. When I do, I'll send out one final email to everybody with instructions on how to sign up for the new list. I'm in the process of starting a new website. And for the tutorials and the sound libraries that I do and other things, I'm going to make a unified single mailing list. Now, I don't send out hardly any emails on that mailing list as it is, and I don't expect that will change a lot in the future, but I've decided to roll all my various projects into one unified mailing list, and UCS will just become a part of that. So any new updates from UCS will be sent out on this new mailing list. It's not up and running yet. Once it is, I'll send out again a final email to UCS email list. I won't enroll anybody automatically. You'll just have the chance to basically click through and opt into the new mailing list if you want to. Eventually, the hope is maybe sometime this year, with the help of somebody who's offered up some time, potentially in the coming summer maybe, we'll build a new website for UCS. And rather than having all of the files and tools available on Dropbox, we'll simply have them all hosted on our website. maybe even doing some interesting things with web tools and web apps that we might be able to incorporate the system right into a web page that's a little more functional than what we have right now, which is purely informative and just provides a bunch of links. This doesn't mean that down the line there may not be new tools. It's possible that down the line someone will want to translate the list into another language, and if they do, we'll certainly include that or reincorporate it into the list. So it's not that no more development might happen with the system. Other programs may choose to adopt it. All of those things are possible. It's just that the list itself won't change anymore. And the support tools that are out there, the Slack group, the Facebook page, all those things that are available, the YouTube channel will always remain. The YouTube channel won't be updated much beyond this final video, but the tools that are there remain. I've cleaned up a couple things. I deleted a couple of old videos that will be slightly more confusing. And I'm going to post one final new single overview video that's about 36 minutes in long. It was originally something I did for something called the Sound Girls Conference, but I think it's probably the best single introduction video to the whole system. So I've cleaned it up a little bit. So I'm going to post it at the same time that I post this video. So let's have a look at the new list. And the first thing you'll notice, it's still in Excel spreadsheet format. And if you look down at the bottom, you'll see that there are now two tabs. There's one that says 8.2 new items marked and one that says clean. And these are exactly the same list, but in one of them you can see marked in red all of the new subcategories, which we're going to go through in a second. And there's a version here where you have just a clean version. I realize that not everybody needs to look at all the new versions. Maybe you're just starting out with the system fresh. You don't really care what the new items are. You just want to use the list. So you basically have the list in two different formats. If I start scrolling across, we'll see all the translations. We now have French, Polish, German, Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, Simple Chinese, Traditional Chinese, Spanish, Japanese, Norwegian, Danish, Swedish, Finnish, Russian, Ukrainian, Italian, Dutch, Turkish, Korean is new, and Hindi, which is still being worked on. This will be cleaned up and hopefully done by the time I post this final version. It's being done right now by our friend Prashant in India. And one thing I should point out is that these synonyms, most of these are simply done by AI. I redid most of these using a program called DeepL, which seemed a little better than Google Translate. It didn't have some of the languages. So the synonyms themselves take with a grain of salt. I'm sure they're going to be wildly inaccurate at times, but the idea is to just still do the best we can to translate them, and hopefully they're still useful in some capacity. Now, the category and subcategories have been done more or less by hand by native speakers, and they should be quite accurate at this point. We've gone through them one more time, certain languages. We've improved some of them a little bit more each time. So there are definitely changes made here to the translations of the categories and subcategories for certain languages especially. One thing before I talk through the new categories I just want to show off. Some people have asked for something like a single sheet overview of the system. And so I've made something like that. This is basically a very high resolution PDF. I have it in two slightly different aspect ratios. Some people have chosen to basically make this their desktop. If they really were working with the system a lot, it might be useful to see like that. I actually printed a poster for myself. So I made this in a high enough resolution that, you could put this on a very high screen monitor or do whatever you want with it. And if you zoom in, you can start to see that, it's quite high resolution. You can scroll around and you can see the entire system, the category, the subcategory, and the cat ID, basically in this sort of huge poster form. And this is the 8.2 version of the list, final list as it says. And so this will be available as well on the website. One thing that I'll probably do on the new Dropbox when I release 8.2 is I'll make a single downloadable file that contains pretty much the entirety of the Dropbox folder. I realize it's right now there's a bunch of different folders and people have to click around to find things. I might make just a single Mac and a single PC download that contains the list, all the tools, the Keyboard Maestro macros, the poster, the logos, pretty much everything in just one easy download. And I'll put that right on the top level of the Dropbox folder eventually. But okay, let's have a quick look through the new subcategories. Again, there are quite a few new ones now, but there's a lot of repetition within those. And in a lot of cases, what we've done is make certain categories like the material categories, glass, plastic, wood, paper, a little bit more consistent. Some of them were missing certain categories that other ones had, and now they're much more in line with each other. So a lot of the new categories are really within those. So first off, we've added the door subcategory to a couple categories like aircraft, trains, and boats. These types of doors are unique enough that we decided to have it be a subcategory within those transportation type categories. So we have vehicle door already, that already existed. So we thought we better add aircraft, train, and boat. So you'll see those. Just a few new ambience subcategories, fantasy and sci-fi for sort of composite built ambiences within those. Something like a Lord of the Rings composite ambience file might go here. Ambience insect for thick beds of insects beyond just sort of singular things. This is some overlap certainly with animal insect, but it seemed like it would be useful enough to have. Ambience residential is kind of a new one. The idea here is that something in between a room tone and, say, an urban ambience. So, you might have an apartment in New York City, but you're still recording it in the home. So it doesn't quite go in urban, which tends to imply an outdoor ambience, but it's more busy than a room tone. It has activity. It has things from outside, maybe sirens and car alarms and things like that. So really, ambience residential is designed for something you recorded inside in a place of residence that's busier than a room tone in and of itself. So we had Cats Wild category for things like tigers and lions, and this was an omission. We should have fixed this in the first go around, but we're going to add now a Dogs Wild category, basically, or Dog Wild. And this is where things like wolves, foxes, coyotes, dingoes, things like that would go. So we're really splitting the dog category from domestic dogs into wild dogs. I would like to have taken the original dog category and renamed it, but because of the rule I gave myself at the beginning, which was that I was never going to rename or rework any of the original list, we're just going to leave that as dogs, and now we have Dog Wild. 3 new additions to the archived thing to sort of fill out this category: ADR, loop group, and production, places to store those types of usually dialogue recordings and to archive them. Again, there's the boat door category. We've also added a boats underwater. Now, this isn't a submarine that has its own category, but this is for recordings of boats made from underwater. This was something that was specifically requested, and I thought it was a decent idea. Kai had brought up a few interesting additions to the cartoon category, so they've been added. So cartoon animal, cartoon machines, cartoon vehicles, and cartoon vocals. Just trying to fill out the cartoon category with certain stylistic things that tend to pop up a lot in cartoons. So that's been expanded a bit. Now here you see this subcategory called handle. Now I've added this to pretty much all of the material categories like ceramic, glass, wood, metal, plastic. We had a movement category, but movement sort of implied objects of plastic or objects of ceramic moving around. But we didn't really have a way to describe when somebody's just handling something, picking something up, setting it down, holding it in their hands, transferring it between their hands. We had guns handling or guns handle. So I realized that maybe a handle subcategory was a smart thing to add to the material. So a lot of the number of subcategories is really the addition of this handle category. You'll also see that if we look at cloth, impact has been added. That was not there before. And again, we're trying to fill out sort of some of these material categories to be more consistent. So you'll see that that's been added. And honestly, a lot of this list is adding those material categories. A few things now added to design to try to fill out that category one last time: granular, designed impacts, designed morphs, and rhythmic designed. The explanations here will kind of explain to you what those things are. And also designed whoosh was one that's been requested a lot. I was hesitant to do it, but I think it's a good idea for very overtly stylized, designy whooshes. Again, you can see dirt and sand now has a tonal for something like singing sand dunes. Also a handle category. Doors doesn't really change much. We're adding one more composite. Somebody brought up, what about a door like a fiberglass door that doesn't really fit any of the other materials? So a composite door could be something like a traditional modern front door, usually made out of fiberglass, something like that. So fire turbulent is a new addition. Basically, I was thinking, what about some just really, really violent sounding fire swirling, something like that? Didn't really find a home that made sense to me, so I've added that. We had water turbulent already in the list, so I've added it for fire and wind, thinking those are 2 more things that can often be, very turbulent sounding. Pour is added to food and drink, just for pouring liquid, water, things like that. Again, you see in the explanation some overlap with water pour, right? So there's always going to be potential overlaps and things, and I try to call them out in the explanations to make sense. But something like pouring a beer, pouring a glass of wine, these things, there's enough of these types of sounds that it made sense to add this into it as a subcategory. Again, here we see the handle subcategory added for glass. Human gets expanded out a little bit with some things that were just missing. So human blow, human pee, human skin, human sniff, human vomit. These were all requests by certain companies that wanted to have these in the list. So they've been added. There's handle added to ice, handle added to leather. 2 new categories for machines, garden and gym. So I was thinking things like weed whackers, lawnmowers, things like that. They'll also appear down in tools and objects, these 2 categories. So gym, jump ropes, exercise bikes, things like that. Treadmills would go here for machines, gym. Just things that didn't really have an obvious home before. There's the handle category added to metal. Movement gets 1 more subcategory called human. This one's a little contentious, probably. The explanation kind of tries to describe what we were thinking or what I was thinking. Movement of a single person. So not footsteps, but standing, shuffling, things like that, this would often be done in Foley maybe, or coming from production. And it's a little bit overlapped with movement activity. It's maybe a little less active than something like movement activity, but there you go, we're adding that. And musical gets expanded out a bit. Now, this was one that had been asked of me many, many, many times. And the big issue here is that we aren't first and foremost a music list, right? It's a sound effects list. So music was one of the things that, could be expanded out into an entire list in and of itself. And I've encouraged, people who were really interested in doing that to do something like that. But there are a lot of people who contain musical samples, and we wanted to at least try to expand it out a bit more, try to make it a little more functional for things like music. So we've added a bells subcategory. We've added an experimental subcategory. We've added musical keyed. Now, keyed things are some things like pianos and harpsichords. This is a bit of a point of contention by some people because a piano is technically a percussion instrument, right? Or some people consider it a stringed instrument. So we just said, okay, well, let's find a way around that problem by just calling them keyed instruments. Tuned percussion, which are basically things like xylophones and marimbas and things like that, steel drums. Musical performance for a single recording of a performed musical piece. So somebody said, what about recording somebody's band in their garage, practice or something like that. Plucked instruments, so things like guitars, harps, banjos, shaken instruments like maracas, tambourines, rattles, and synthesized, which is a big category in and of itself. And it's not so much for samples. You see there is also a sample subcategory for sort of triggered samples, but for synthesized pieces of music or synthesized instruments. So I consulted with a few people who are much more in the music industry, and this was sort of the best we came up with for a musical. I'm sure it's not going to appease everybody, but hopefully it's better than we had and will be a little more functional for people who need to classify musical things in their sound effects libraries. So 4 new objects added: fashion for things like shoes, belts, clothes. We had jewelry, but we realized there wasn't really a good place for something like a necktie or something like that. Again, garden and gym appear here as objects as well, in addition to them being in machines. So for garden objects, things like flower pots, bird feeders, things you would find in a garden. And gym, maybe jump ropes, yoga mats, dumbbells, things like that would be an object you'd find in a gym. And office objects. This was one that we should have had probably from the beginning, but things like staplers, paper cutters, things you'd find in an office. Again, we see now here the handle and the tonal subcategories added to plastic. Quite a few people had asked for an interior subcategory for rain, which I think makes sense. We have rain on all these different surfaces, and even interior recording could fit into one of those, but interior rain recordings tend to have a pretty unique sound, and so it makes sense to finally just have an interior rain recording. Again, a bunch more expansion here in the categories of materials. So handle gets added to rocks, handle and impact gets added to ropes, handle and tonal get added to rubber. Sci-fi gets a new impact category. This is at the request of certain people who do shows like Star Trek and other things, like a bolt of sci-fi energy or something like that. Snow gets a handle subcategory. Tools also gets a garden subcategory for more or less hand tools you'd use in a garden. Rakes, hose, shovels, things like that. Trains gets the door subcategory, as we mentioned earlier. Vehicles emergency. Now, this is one that we probably should have had from the beginning. And it's true that you could classify any emergency vehicle also as a truck or a car, but they're a common enough thing: an ambulance, a fire truck, a police car, that they really do need their own subcategory. So vehicles emergency is now added. Voices gets one new one. Whisper, we realized there wasn't a particular place for a single voice performing very, very quietly. We had a crowd's quiet category, so voices whisper is the sort of singular equivalent to that. Water underwater, this is one that was requested numerous times. We had talked ourselves out of it numerous times, but the truth is it's going to be a useful subcategory for underwater recordings, things like somebody swimming or water flows underwater. There's also an ambience underwater and also a water movement subcategory, so there's some potential overlap with these, but have a look at the explanations. Weapons axe was requested, slightly different than a sword. Wind turbulent is one that I've added as well. Again, the idea here is, you're doing something like a dust devil or almost like a tornado, but doesn't quite fit in tornado, but just a very, very violent sounding wind. And lastly, handle gets added to wood. So that's it. So it's really not that bad. Again, a lot of these expansions are in these material categories in an attempt to try to make them more consistent with each other. And the handle subcategory was certainly, added into a dozen or more of these. So I think that's it. That's the new list, and hopefully the last list, and hopefully it will be useful and continue to be useful. And again, I hope later this year, potentially we may see a new homepage that sort of unifies all these tools and makes them even easier to download. But for now, we'll stick with either the Google Drive or the Dropbox method for distributing the files. And as always, I need to give a shout out to everybody who's helped with this project. It has taken me a massive amount of time, but lots of other people have also volunteered their time, especially Justin Drury from SoundMiner and Kai Paquin, who, have put in next to me the most time with this. All the people we call the Brain Trust that helped build the list, all the people who helped with all the translations in the 20 different languages. I'm going to try to get everybody's name up on the homepage. I'm still trying to track down some of the names that help with the translations, but this system wouldn't have been possible without all of their help as well. So a huge thank you to all of them. Thank you very much for your interest in this little COVID project of mine. It turned out better than I had hoped. It became much more widely adopted than I had ever sort of imagined, and I'm grateful for that, and I'm proud of that. And so with that, I just want to say, again, thank you to everybody who's using the system, people who worked on it, people who send me kind emails saying that it's made their organization easier, and made their lives easier, maybe their jobs easier. That's all we ever wanted to do when we set out with this idea. And I hope it continues to be useful for a long time to come. Thank you so much, everybody.